distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sampat, Ratjatawan, Public Prosecutor at Nitivajra Insitute, Office of the Attorney General. I will be the moderator for this side event. On behalf of Nitivajra Insitute, it's my honor and great pleasure to express our warm welcome to you and open the side event on the topic, Elimination of Online Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation, which I will now call Elimination of OXI. This side event's main objective is to understand more about how to address online child sexual abuse and exploitation from different dimensions. Obviously, this topic is the current global agenda that demands full attention by relevant authorities. Thank you so much for your attention and support. To start this side event, I would like to introduce you to our speaker for today. The first speaker is Marium Hussein. Marium served as a research coordinator at UNICEF Office of Research in Innocenti since 2019. In her role at UNICEF, Marium has supported in the design, analysis, and coordination of the disrupting harm research and supports other research activities on children's use of digital technologies. Today, Marium is going to elaborate to us on the current situation of OXI, which she found on her research, Disrupting Harm in Thailand. Our second speaker today is Samantha. Samantha is currently the manager of the NCA education team who run a UK education program which educates children and young people, as well as teachers and parents about online child sexual abuse. Samantha has been delivering child protection education for the last 15 years. Her topic today is about using preventive education to reduce the vulnerability of children and young people to the threat of online child sexual abuse. The third topic today, which is about Thailand's response to OXI, will be presented by me. I will explain how Thailand managed OXI criminal cases with existing legislation, and also key steps that have been taken by the government to combat OXI, also perspectives of legislative reform. The last topic today about victim-focused investigation strategy used in tackling abuse and exploitation of children using the internet will be presented by Virginia Kiddle. Virginia has been a law enforcement officer for over 20 years, working in a number of child sexual abuse cases. She now leads on capacity building for child sexual offenses within National Crime Agency. Now, I would like to invite Marium to present her topic. Marium, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sampat. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. And as Sampat mentioned, I'm going to be presenting mainly the findings from the Disrupting Harm in Thailand report, which we launched just this February. But I'm going to be also pointing out some similarities and differences between the other countries where we conducted this study wherever I can. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so to go to the next slide, please. So to start, I'm just going to give you an overview of what the Disrupting Harm study is. So it's a research initiative that started in 2019, and it's supported by the Fund to End Violence Against Children. And through this research, we really aim to gather comprehensive evidence on the nature and scope of online child sexual exploitation and abuse, which I'm going to use a slightly different acronym, OXEA, as well as how national systems are responding to these forms of violence against children. So we applied the same methodology in the 13 countries that you can see on this map, which are spread across Eastern and Southern Africa and Southeast Asia, including Thailand, of course. And the research was conducted by ECPAT International, Interpol, and UNICEF Office of Research, and of course, with the help of our networks on a national level. And data collection took place from early 2020 to early 2021. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just walk you briefly through our methodology. So as you can see here, it's quite complex. So it consists of 9 separate research activities that, when triangulated together, give us a pretty good understanding of OXEA in Thailand and in the other 12 countries where we conducted the study. So we used a multi-method approach, and we engaged with multiple different stakeholders, including policymakers, justice professionals, law enforcement, social support staff, and of course, children themselves. And you can see the individual research activities represented in each box in this grid. So I won't go through each one just for the sake of time, but for my presentation today, I'm going to focus mostly on data coming from children. But there's, of course, a lot more in the report itself, and there's a detailed methodology that can be found in the report as well. So if we go to the next slide. So first, I thought it might be helpful to discuss our definition of Oxea, because there isn't always a universally accepted definition. So in the Disrupting Harm study, we defined Oxea as situations involving digital technology at any point during the continuum of sexual exploitation or abuse of a child. And this is because we recognize that Oxea can occur fully online in the digital environment, or through a combination of online and in-person interactions between offenders and children. So just to give you an example, if a child is being targeted online and is then tricked or coerced into meeting the offender where sexual abuse occurs in person, this would still fall under our definition of Oxea. And this is a really important distinction for this kind of work. So the specific types of abuse that we capture within this definition of Oxea include grooming of children for sexual purposes, which you can see on the right of the slide, producing, disseminating, and possessing child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, and live streaming of sexual abuse. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go into one of our first findings from the report. So what do we know about Oxea? So we conducted a nationally representative survey with 12 to 17-year-old children who are internet users and one of their caregivers. And from the data, we found that in the past year alone, 9% of children in this age group in Thailand were victims of Oxea. And this statistic is an aggregate that includes let's call them typologies of Oxea that you see in the slide in purple. So according to our estimates, when scaled to the population, this 9% of children actually represents an estimated 400,000 12 to 17-year-old internet users in Thailand who have been subjected to any of these harms that you see on the slide in just 1 year. So also one thing to note is that we don't see very many notable differences in the proportion of children who have been subjected to Oxea across sex, age group, or levels of urbanity. And this just reiterates that the need for all children to receive equal protection from these forms of violence. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So next is the data that we have on offenders. And according to the data from the household survey, which is self-reported by children, we know that people known to the child make up a much bigger proportion of offenders compared to strangers. This was a common finding in the majority of countries where we conducted the study. The exception to this was the Philippines, where children were most often targeted by people they didn't know. And specifically in Thailand, and this was the case for actually all forms of Oxea that we measured in our survey, friends were the most likely to commit these forms of violence against children. And this was usually followed by strangers, which accounted for 1 in 5 cases, although this varied slightly depending on the type of abuse in question. And just my last 2 points on offenders, romantic partners and family members were the least likely to commit these forms of violence in Thailand across the board. And according to frontline workers that we also surveyed as part of our methodology, the offenders in their caseloads, which included cases of Oxea in the past year, were more commonly Thai nationals compared to foreigners. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about where children are targeted. So we asked children if they were targeted in person or online via social media or online games. And we found that it was most common for children to be targeted via social media. And for those children whose last experience of sexual exploitation and abuse occurred on social media, we asked them which platform they were targeted on. And it was most commonly on Facebook or Facebook Messenger. And that accounted for about 70 to 80% of responses, again, depending on the type of Oxea in question. Other platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram also featured quite strongly in children's responses, but to a lesser degree than Facebook or Facebook Messenger. And this is most likely because these are just the largest platforms and the most popular platforms, and it's where children spend most of their time when they're online. One interesting exception to this was Line, which we didn't see show up in the results as much as we thought it would, given its popularity in Thailand. So if we go to the next slide. So our data showed that children who were subjected to Oxea tended to confide in people within their interpersonal networks, especially their mothers. And this was normally followed by a friend or a sibling. This was a unique finding in Thailand because in all other disrupting harm countries, children would rely on their friends for disclosure first and foremost, and then caregivers were a much lower proportion than what we've seen in Thailand. So mothers or female caregivers could be a good entry point for encouraging disclosure of abuse in Thailand. So I should also note that there is a minority of children, and I think an important minority, that said that they didn't tell anyone about their abuse. And from the household survey, we found that across the different experiences of Oxea that we asked about, around 8 to 15% of children didn't tell anyone about what happened to them. And I'll cover barriers to disclosure in a second. We also found that caregivers and children were reluctant to turn to formal reporting mechanisms, for example, helplines or to the police. And this was another common finding among all disrupting harm study countries. In Thailand specifically, almost no one that we surveyed who had experienced or been subjected to Oxea reported their abuse to the police or a helpline. It was between 1 to 4%, depending on the indicator or the typology of Oxea that we were looking at. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about some of the barriers to disclosure. So according to the children that we surveyed, the most common barrier to disclosure was not knowing where to go or who to tell, which really reflects a lack of awareness, and also not thinking that what happened to them was serious enough to report. We also, as I said, surveyed frontline social support staff who had been responsible for cases of Oxea in the past year. And we asked them for their perceptions around the barriers to disclosure. And respondents indicated that stigma from the community was a main factor influencing reporting to Oxea. And the stigma was reflected in the interviews with justice actors as well, and also interviews with survivors and their caregivers, which revealed that children are sometimes not treated as victims of crime by their communities as well as by justice actors, but rather as offenders. So, for example, several respondents would talk about children committing Oxea instead of being victims of Oxea. And actually, children also who we interviewed were also shared that they were afraid to tell their caregivers about their experiences of abuse because they were afraid that they would be blamed for what happened to them. So if we go to my next slide, which is actually the last slide, so just to give you some key takeaways from our access to justice findings. So as I said, there was a reluctance to report abuse through formal reporting channels. And while it's unclear from the data why children and caregivers are hesitant to make formal reports to the police and helplines specifically, we did interview children and caregivers who did report their abuse. And first, I should note that the findings that I'm about to present are based on quite small samples, which means that we can't really generalize these findings to the wider population. But it does give us some understanding of what children's experiences can look like if they do decide to go to the police and to the courts to seek justice after being subjected to Oxea. So we found, firstly, some very promising practices based on children's experiences. So, for example, all the children we interviewed said that the offenders were arrested and prosecuted within a short period of time. And some of the children were also informed of the conviction. All of the children who we interviewed were supported through the court processes by either a social worker or a lawyer from one of the NGOs that were supporting them. But the interviews also revealed that the process of filing a report to the police was sometimes unclear to children. Sometimes children just didn't know how to go about filing a report or where to go. And this, again, reiterates one of the key barriers to children reporting their abuse in the first place, is that they simply don't know where to go. And enforcement of child-friendly interview methods was also not consistently applied. For example, ensuring that there was enough privacy or giving the child an option to select an officer to interview them. And similarly, while some children and caregivers were informed about their rights and the process ahead of time, others were not, and this led those children to feel a bit lost throughout the process. Some children also said that the justice process was quite difficult for them because they had to recount their experiences of abuse numerous times. One child that we interviewed said that they recounted their experience as many as 6 times, and this led to a re-traumatization. The language used by lawyers and judges was also complex at times and not always age appropriate. And half of the children that we interviewed also said that they had to sit in the same room as their offender while they were in court. And finally, some children also said that the process of seeking compensation was time-consuming and complicated. So overall, we found that there are good foundations and policies in place, but it's sometimes the consistent implementation of those policies that can be a hurdle in the access to justice process. So those are all the findings I have. If we go to the next slide, I've just linked our report, which contains much more data than what I've presented today, as well as a set of recommendations based on the evidence that we have that aims to build on the good work that's already being done in Thailand to address Hoxia. So I've linked the English and Thai versions of the reports in case colleagues are interested in learning more. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand it back to Sampat.
Okay, thank you very much, Marium. Your disrupting harm research in Thailand allow us to understand more about what is Oxy and how is it happening, and also understand more about the current Thailand situation on this issue. So, and also your research allow us to know how Thai data that you have found differ from other countries. Now, let's move to explore how the UK addressed the problem using education as a preventive measure. Our second speaker for today, please welcome Virginia Kiddle.
Oh, it's Samantha Marks on the education.
Sorry, yeah, Samantha.
That's okay, don't worry. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for some of you. Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on some of the points which have been made in the report and sort of highlight some of the things that we've been doing in the UK. Let's see if this works. Okay, just take that out. So in the UK, we have been running an education programme since 2006. So we've had many years to really think about how we do this and how we integrate some of those things. And in the report that Marium just talked about, there were a number of things around education which were drawn out as needed when we're tackling this. So there was things around making sure we're including that online element when we're talking about child sexual abuse. And as Marium highlighted, actually that can be quite intricate. It can happen online, but it could also happen online and then go offline, or start offline and go online. So we really do need to help people to understand how that element of the online can differ. There were some points around making sure that we're working with children, caregivers and teachers so that we understand their experience and their lived experience when we're giving them advice and awareness and raising those messages. Some of the advice in the report focused on making sure children get the skills that they need, ensuring they know how to get help, as Marium was mentioning at the end there. One of the biggest barriers is not knowing where to go. And there were some messages in there around sort of understanding how sex education builds into this. So children understanding their rights and also what is kind of a healthy or an unhealthy relationship within that framework of sex education. And there was also some advice in the report around making sure that teachers and caregivers have a really good understanding that, all of child abuse, but especially child sexual abuse, links back to children's right to be protected from harm. And they kind of use that as a basis, but also that they understand what children do online. So they understand how the online space can facilitate offenders, can facilitate that abuse happening. So I want to pick up some of those points based on what we do in the UK. As I say, in the UK, our education programme began very early in 2000s, more generally about online safety, but actually it's evolved over the years. And since 2006, our education programme has been part of our law enforcement response, in a way, to the threat of online child sexual abuse. And the programme seeks to educate from three areas, as highlighted here. It seeks to educate teachers, professionals working with children and young people, so they can understand what we mean by online child sexual abuse, so they understand the ways it can happen, but also how they can respond to it. So it's really important that, you know, if people are working with children and young people, that they understand this, especially if they may be the people that children and young people talk to. The second strand of this programme is very much children's knowledge, skills and resilience. So how can we make it give them the skills to be safer, to make choices, to know especially how to seek help and when they need it. So that's a real core stream of our programme. And finally, and again, as Marium mentioned, in Thailand, you know, caregivers, mothers are often the first person that a child will speak to, and that's true in the UK as well. So making sure that parents and carers have the knowledge and skills to help their children, so that actually if a child does tell them something's happening, they know how to respond. They know how to respond in a positive way, and we pick up some of those messages around, you know, not blaming the child for what's happened, making sure that they're supporting the child, and also giving the parents and carers support themselves. So we're in a really unique position. So there is a lot of online safety general education across the UK, as I'm sure there is in many countries. But for us, building our programme, especially as we're focusing on online child sexual abuse, we are in the lucky position that we have lots of research and intelligence to draw from. So being part of the National Crime Agency means that we can use that intelligence that our colleagues who are working on those serious cases gain, and we can use that to think about, well, what can we do? How can we use that to educate others? How can we use, for example, the tactics that we see offenders using? How can we take that and turn that into a piece of education which will help either teachers, young people, or parents and carers? Also, because we lead the national response to child sexual abuse, it means that we draw together partners and we're aware of the latest research. We're involved sometimes in commissioning that. So we are always at the front end of knowing what's going on. So again, all of our stuff is drawn on research, and that's really important, in that if we're educating others, we need to make sure that we're evidence-based and that we're really drawing on what we know. So we also included in there is also the consultation with experts, so linking with other national government organisations and academics, knowing from practitioners what difficulties that they're facing, what they're seeing through their cases, also helps us. So again, we're making sure that what we're creating is relevant for everybody. Over the years, we've also seen that it's really important to embed our education for young people within the school curriculum, because that makes it easier for teachers to be able to use the lessons that we provide. So, you know, it gives them a real tangible way to make sure, you know, that as they're teaching across the board of healthy relationships, but also thinking about technology, we can link that in with them. And then finally, and again, this was drawn out in the recommendations of the report for Thailand, that direct engagement with children and young people. Every resource we create, we use children and young people, we use professionals, we use parents and carers, either to help us to create that or to review our creations as we're doing it. So when we create a website for children and young people, they help us to test that, they help us to create the messages. So again, we can make sure that it really is focused on their lived experience and it's really relevant for them. So our education is progressive. So we start at 4 years old and we work all the way up to 18. We really think about those building blocks and how we can build on that knowledge, making sure it's age appropriate and linked to, you know, very much linked to the relationships and sex education curriculum, because a lot of what we talk about with child sexual abuse is about relationships, is about helping children to understand what's okay and what's not okay, what's healthy, what's normal behavior, so then they can identify when things are not okay. So some of those core topic areas definitely, you know, look at healthy and unhealthy relationships. Obviously, for 4-year-olds, we don't talk in that way. We talk about, you know, good friends or bad friends. And as we get older, we then start introducing those more complex understandings, because, you know, they're at the age and the stage of their development to understand that. We talk about asking for permission or consent throughout all of our resources. And again, for 4-year-olds, you know, that's about asking permission to share a photo. When it gets to 14-year-olds, we might be talking about, you know, consent in the space of sharing pictures within a relationship, sharing nude selfies. What does pressurized consent look like? So each of those resources builds on the previous knowledge, so those children are gaining in their experience. We talk about recognizing tactics, as I said, and again, we don't talk about offenders necessarily, but within our resources, we'll talk about the tactics people might use to pressure you to do something you don't want to do, the tactics maybe even used by your own friends to send silly pictures when you don't want it. So again, it helps us to start developing those kind of problem solving and critical skills to identify when something's not right, and very much linking that to how the child is feeling. Do they feel worried about what's happening? Do they feel pressured? Do they feel sad? Is it making them feel uncomfortable in what they're doing? And then that final really key message, which is drawn throughout all of our resources, is how to seek support. And this is really important, as Marium highlighted from the report, in that many children feel scared to report, they feel they're to blame. So we're very lucky in the UK is that we focus on that talking to a trusted adult, whether that be a parent or carer or a teacher, but we also have a reporting system at the NCA so that children and young people who feel they can't talk to a trusted adult they know can go online and report directly to us. And I think this is a really important part, because we've made it in consultation with children and young people, but we also make sure it's child friendly. So although it's a police reporting system, they have child protection advisors, they have a website which takes them through each step and guides them and really makes them feel that they can turn to us if they need to report straight to us. So I think all of these things really help to think about how we develop education in a responsive way. So it needs to build on the progressive nature. It needs to link to, you know, that kind of relationship building skills. But we also need to make sure that children have lots of avenues that they can go and report to, as well as centrally, that is friendly, that is going to meet their needs, that they're going to feel trusted to talk to. And just to give an overview, in our public reporting, we probably get around 400 to 500 reports from children. Not all of them we follow up, but every month that's about the number of reports we get through that reporting centre. So we do have children who do want to talk to us directly. And finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges, because as I say, you know, our program's been going for over 15 years. We've learned a lot over the years around what we do and how we do it. We're always learning. And, you know, currently we reach around a third of all UK schools. So we definitely still have lots of work to do. And some of those challenges we face include the confidence of the teachers who may be teaching those programs. Is often they don't feel that they have the knowledge or experience, or they feel that they need to know more about technology. And it's really important that, you know, when you're delivering education, that the educators feel that they are in control, that they're confident about those messages that they're giving. We also know that, you know, one of the challenges is there is a lot of awareness raising and education out there. There are lots of other organisations who are talking about online safety, not so many talking about child sexual abuse, and definitely less talking about online child sexual abuse. So for us, really focusing in on our target area and understanding our expertise has been beneficial in saying, well, this is what we do and this is what they do, but also making sure we align ourselves with the messages that everyone's giving. So for us as a team, we work across the sector to make sure that everybody in education is kind of saying the same thing, because otherwise, you know, children will hear a different message from one person as to another person. So that's a really important consideration, I think, if you are working across the education sector. Also, kind of what I've called selling the brands. The National Crime Agency kind of sounds quite scary for some children and young people when we're talking about what we do to educate. So it's really important that actually adults understand what we do as the National Crime Agency, but children and young people have an interface that is very child friendly. And so we use our CEOP education brand rather than the National Crime Agency brand when we're talking to children and young people. And actually, each of the resources has a theme rather than focusing in on the bigger picture. We talk about the CEOP Safety Centre rather than the National Crime Agency police reporting system. So each of those times thinking about, you know, how do we appeal to children and young people, but also to professionals, because actually professionals really and teachers really value the National Crime Agency as an expert. So they do see the value within that. And probably for many of you, you know, the limitations on resources are one of the other challenges for anybody who's developing education. So we have a finite amount of both money and staff resources. So we always seek to do the best that we can with what we have. And I think this is important because some of our resources will take maybe, you know, hundreds or £200,000 to create these creative resources. And then when you have to think about keeping them up to date, it's really important, you know, that you have that budget, but also the expertise in-house to be able to keep building on those so that you don't have messages which go out of date, because, you know, obviously there's nothing worse than, you know, hearing something for a child where they think actually maybe that's no longer relevant to me. So those are some of the challenges, and I think that these pick up on some of the messages which Marium talked about. So, you know, really making sure that we build on those challenges and deliver education across the board.
Sampat, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry. All right. Thank you so much, Samantha. We should now all realize that education is the key to eliminate Oxy and also could help protect children and young people from the threat and reduce their vulnerability from Oxy crimes. Okay, now I would like to walk you through the situation about Oxy in Thailand and how government agencies deal with it. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Again, what I would like to present to you today is on the topic of Thailand's response to Oxy. Okay. I will begin with some interesting statistics and figures. In the first slide, this infographic shows that internet use is widespread among children and adolescents in Thailand. According to a report published by Data Reportal, in the third quarter of last year, Thai internet users spent approximately 9 hours using the internet. And of course, smartphones are by far the most popular devices used to go online among children. And the most popular online activities among children aged 12 to 18 years old in Thailand are leisure or entertainment, primarily watching online videos, using social medias, or playing games. And what's interesting about this statistic is that in a survey, 61% of respondents said they use the internet to play online games on a weekly basis. And in the survey, children also responded that they had been offered money or game items to meet in person with offender or to engage in sexual activities. And I think this is consistent with the finding from Disrupting Harm report in Thailand. Right. As you can see on the screen, the national survey conducted by the Child Online Protection Action Thailand, or COPAT, in 2020 showed that Thai children are increasingly exposed to different forms of online abuse, with 17% of respondents reporting having been sexually harassed, and that includes being groomed or being pressured to share their sexual images, as you can see on the yellow in pie chart. And next, as you can see, the data supplied by the Thailand Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, or THAICAC, show that cases of online sexual abuse of children in Thailand have risen dramatically during the pandemics, as children are forced to stay at home, turning to technology for learning and play, and spending large amount of time on their smartphones. So in the first 4 months of COVID and last year, you can see the jump in the cases of exploitation. I will move on to the existing legal framework that Thai law enforcement use in dealing with child exploitation and abuse. So basically, the Penal Code and the Computer Crime Act are primarily legislations that apply to these crimes. In this slide, as you can see, Thai Penal Code explicitly criminalize processing or distributing child pornography. Despite the fact that under the current Thailand regulatory framework, there is no specific legal provision prohibiting behavior such as sending sexual texting to underage person, it's possible to argue that the sexting text is under the definition of child pornography as prescribed by the Penal Code. As shown on the screen, the definition of child pornography covers several types of materials or objects, whether they are in the form of documents, painting, videotapes, or pictures. So in addition to the Penal Code, currently the Computer Crime Act prohibits bringing into a computer system any computer data of a pornographic nature if such data is accessible by the general public. And the Act also prohibits disseminating or forwarding a computer data that contains pornographic materials. So any person who perpetrates the following offense shall be subject to imprisonment up to 5 years in Thailand. And I will go on to highlight what I see as the main challenges for law enforcement in dealing with oxy crime. Obviously, the online environment of the 21st century has transformed criminality in a number of ways, and that pose serious challenges to relevant law agencies. In Thailand, without specific and explicit provision criminalizing oxy-related crimes, the Penal Code and Computer Crime Act have been used by competent authority to prosecute offenders. To successfully tackle an evolving range of oxy offense, there is still a need to develop national legislation that allows punishment of wide range of criminal conducts. And lack of legislative requirement for internet service providers or hosts is another challenge that I think is quite crucial. However, without this requirement, under the existing legislation, the Computer Crime Act authorized competent officials to request court orders to block content that might be constituting an offense under the Act, which include bringing into a computer system any computer data of a pornographic nature. However, in the future, I think we are in the process of discussing about the mandatory requirement for ISP or host to report or automatically remove the abusive content. And also deficiencies in current rule governing digital evidence collection, in particular in the context of cross-border investigations, is another challenge. Oxy crimes are typically borderless. However, law enforcement is typically national designed to uphold state-owned legal frameworks and not well structured to facilitate international information sharing and cooperation. So these are challenges that I think quite crucial to Thai authorities. So let's have a look at some key findings and recommendations from the Disrupting Harm in Thailand report. The report found that neither the Thai Penal Code nor any other law explicitly criminalize oxy-related offenses and suggests that Thailand should amend the legislation by explicitly criminalizing these crimes. Law enforcement officers struggle to identify and classify oxy under the current legislation, especially cases with a human trafficking element. as I just mentioned, this day Thailand have two main legislation dealing with Oxy cases, and that is the Thai Penal Code and the Computer Crime Act. So without specific provision, maybe law enforcement officer struggle to identify and interpret the law. And the recommendations of the disrupting harm report is the same with what I think is the most challenging stuff that Thailand have to deal with. That is, Thailand should amend the legislation by explicitly criminalizing specific Oxy-related crimes. Also, the disrupting harm report also suggests that Thailand should introduce legislation and policy that will ensure social media platform and other internet service providers in contributing to the safety of children of their platform. So then let's have a look. I'm sorry, this slide. Okay, so finally, I will end my presentation with some key progresses that Thai government have made in tackling Oxy. In the past decade, Thai government has taken a number of steps to combat Oxy and set commitments to align national laws in this area with international standards. For example, since 2014, Thailand has been committed to a set of international standards and norms under the United Nations Model Strategy and practical measures on the elimination of violence against children in the field of crime prevention and criminal justice. So Thailand is committed to sorry, do you still hear me? The internet, there is some lack of internet connection. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so Thailand is committed to change the law and align the national law with the international standard, right? And in 2015, Thailand's National Legislative Assembly just passed a penal code amendment to criminalize the possession, selling, and production of child sexual abuse material. Also, in 2016, Thailand Internet Crimes Against Children, or TICAC, was established with the help of the FBI and Homeland Security to combat sexual exploitation through shared intelligence. In 2019, Thailand adopted the Asian Regional Plan of Action for the Protection of Children from all forms of online abuse and exploitation. And the Majestic Group, which is a subcommittee created by Thai government to review Oxy-related law, have been in the process of drafting legislations criminalizing specific Oxy crimes such as sexting, accessing to live stream of child sexual abuse, online grooming, sextortion, cyberbullying, and cyberstalking. And as far as I know, this drafting legislation are in the process of government review. Right, so this is my last slide. Now you understand about Thai situation. In the last topic, Virginia will discuss about how to use victim-focused investigation strategy as a tool to solve Oxy. So please welcome our final speaker, Virginia Kiddle.
Thank you very much, Sanpat. I'm hoping that my slides will be shared on the screen for you all. But while that's loading up, I just want to say good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Virginia Kiddle. I'm an operations manager with the National Crime Agency. I manage the Transnational Child Sex Offenders team, or TCSO team, and we sit within the NCA's International Command. As Sam has already said, the NCA leads the UK's response to online child sexual abuse and exploitation, and we have a responsibility to reduce the number of UK offenders who would seek to offend against children overseas. But we can't do this without the support of our global law enforcement and child protection partners. And it's a pleasure today to be among those partners, both as speakers and as people in the audience. So thank you very much for your time. I'd just like to spend a few minutes discussing some of the issues faced by law enforcement with regard to online child sexual abuse, the ways the issues can be addressed, and in particular the importance of having a victim-centred culture within a law enforcement response to online CSAE. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we've touched on this a little bit with Marium's presentation and also Sampat's, but the NCA's strategic assessment from last year estimated that somewhere between 550,000 and 850,000 adults in the UK pose a threat to children with regard to sexual abuse and exploitation. Now, in a UK population of approximately 54 million adults, this equates to somewhere between 1 and 1.5% of the population. And as you can imagine, if this figure is extrapolated globally, particularly when we consider it alongside growing numbers of adults and children using the internet, it's clear that this is an issue that cannot be resolved solely by arresting and prosecuting offenders alone. Exploitation of the online environment is known to enable offline offending. So, for example, where we see grooming of children, which begins with online interactions, but then progresses to offline or contact abuse. It remains highly likely that despite significant operational and policy responses, this online child sexual abuse threat will grow, and it's only going to be exacerbated by rising online activity. So next slide, please. So Sampat has touched on many of the issues that we face in the online world. You know, the amount of adults and children using the internet poses issues for law enforcement, but also consideration of the growing number of internet-enabled devices that each adult or child might have. Devices seized from suspects in criminal investigations will very often be in double figures. And of course, this will pose a problem for law enforcement in terms of the time taken to analyse devices and of course the cost of each full analysis. From an international perspective, many countries are embracing a globalised world, and this inevitably results in an increase in the number of people using the internet. Each different country has legislation regarding internet usage. There are different cultural and behavioural outlooks, for example. So one device may be used by multiple persons within a community, and this can be very difficult for law enforcement to determine who it is that's used a device or an IP address at a particular moment. And of course, the online world develops at breakneck speed, and it can be difficult and expensive for law enforcement and child protection partners to keep pace. The necessary training and upskilling of officers is expensive and time consuming. And sort of alongside that issue, investigations can be thwarted by privacy issues within the cyber world. So where companies have differing rules around releasing data or the progress of end-to-end encryption. So next slide, please. So given the scale of the problem and the associated issues of the online world, it's clear that law enforcement have had to embrace new ways of thinking about tackling online child sexual abuse. And of course, legislation plays a key part in assisting law enforcement efforts, and many of these facets in Thailand have been discussed by Dr. Sampat just now. My colleague Samantha has spoken of the importance of education as a way of preventing offending from taking place and ensuring that reports are made if offending does take place, which is a key factor in tackling this abuse. Law enforcement have come to the realisation that it cannot tackle the problem of online CSAE alone. It relies very heavily upon collaboration between ourselves, partners in private industry, academia, and many charities and non-governmental associations. Gaps in our knowledge of contact and offline offending and how much of a part online offending plays in the part to physical abuse really exist in part due to reliance on victim reporting. And this was brought up in Marium's disrupting harm discussion, where it's really clear that to us as law enforcement officers that gaining accurate information about the scope and potential solutions to the threat of online child sexual abuse isn't possible without effective engagement from victims. And the work to engage victims is vital. And it always distresses me slightly when we see and read these reports where victims are still feeling unsure and uncertain about coming forward. So next slide, please. So bearing in mind the importance of victim engagement and how important this is, how have we in the UK sought to improve this key area? So we've acknowledged that law enforcement has a role to play in safeguarding, and this has been an important step forward. It's not the sole responsibility of our formal child protection partners, for example, social welfare officers, social workers, to safeguard children. This is something that rests with law enforcement as well. The UK has pioneered the use of multi-agency safeguarding hubs, or MASH, you might have heard them referred to as that. And these are ensuring that victims' needs are considered by all the relevant partners, whether this be law enforcement, social workers, health professionals, education partners, for example, schools and teachers. Formalising commitments to victims mandates higher levels of engagement. So victims' codes and charters assist law enforcement teams by outlining timeframes, streamlining collaborative efforts, and signposting victims and their families to essential services. Additionally, creating formal and independent roles such as a victims commissioner can give victims a voice and promote their interests. And this is really useful, for example, when a victims commissioner can give their input into changes or amendments to legislation. Quite a key point is that law enforcement agencies should embrace constructive criticism and be open to regular reviews, both by their own law enforcement review bodies, but also independent bodies. It's really only during these kinds of inspections and reviews that law enforcement agencies can demonstrate their formal victim strategies, their adherence to the obligations that are enshrined in legislation and codes, and really to promote best practice through case studies. Next slide, please. So law enforcement has had to change quite radically in order to begin to tackle online child sexual abuse offending. As mentioned before, many new initiatives have been adopted, for example, prevention campaigns and collaborations with private industry. Working with and engaging more closely with victims has progressed to eliminate the feeling of blame culture, and this is something that has been touched on by previous speakers. Attitudes and ways of thinking have changed dramatically and led to many successful prosecutions. So, for example, in the UK at the moment, the NCA is leading a series of prosecutions as part of Operation Stovewood, which is investigating grooming gangs in the north of England. And this is very much centred on the victim's experience, particularly when it's historic cases that you're looking at. There is still a long way to go in this area. So, for example, UK law enforcement is currently looking at how it can better interact and engage with male victims. And many of our efforts will continue to be scrutinised by the victims commissioners and independent review bodies. Adherence to victim code obligations has led us to adopt formal victim strategies. It takes time, of course, but the use of written and agreed strategies, mandatory planning of victim interviews, and service level agreements regarding contacts and updates from law enforcement officers have been embedded in the way investigations have been conducted. Information sharing is key here, particularly between internal and external partners. And this has had to improve in the UK as a result of some serious case reviews that have occurred after sexual abuse or the death of a child. Law enforcement agencies across the world are now working together to protect the most vulnerable members of our communities. And this might include sharing travel plans for sexual offenders from the UK to Thailand, for example, conducting joint investigations, or taking part in joint capacity building projects or educational exchanges. As information sharing has improved, the potential for sharing the data gathered by all partners from victims and suspects has increased. And information regarding online trends, methods of encryptions, and offender tradecraft, how the offenders go about abusing children, is being regularly shared now between all relevant partners. So very conscious of time and the possibility of questions. So I just wanted to highlight some of the ways that law enforcement is changing, and many of these start with how we think about and treat the victims of online CSE. And if I could just put up the last slide with my contact details. Just thank you very much for your time and attention today. And I will hand back to Dr. Sampat for any questions from yourselves. Thank you.
Right. So thank you so much, Virginia. Thank you for sharing your worthwhile experience and interesting statistics from the UK, and also how the UK use the strategy to lead victims involved in the process, right? So, and now we all have learned different perspectives about OXI. It's time for our participants to ask any questions or contribute your constructive ideas for further development. So please, our participants, any questions? All right, so actually there is one question coming from the participant. I would like to ask maybe Samantha or Virginia, because the question is about the UK. So the question is the preferred approach that many countries are taking to address the OXI crimes such as live streaming is to apply legislation against selling, transmitting, disseminating CSAM, right? And however, in some circumstances, it's children who have made or shared or generated their sexual content consensually. And as a result, the children are criminally liable to the offense. How do UK deal with this kind of situation? Because the children who willingly produce sexual images representing themselves should never be held criminally liable, right? The concept is like that. So how do UK deal with this kind of situation? Thank you.
I think if I start to answer that question, say, for example, from a law enforcement perspective, and then it will naturally lead on to Samantha's input. Certainly from a UK perspective, in terms of law enforcement, very keen not to criminalise children where possible, very much accepting that the online world is still new and it's developing all the time, and the way children interact with the online world will change, and there will be this process of exploration. One thing that the NCA has done, and this has been replicated in the cybercrime world, is going out and identifying those children that are sharing images and speaking to them about the potential impact, how this can affect their life going forward, the need that for them to appreciate that this has a harmful impact and is essentially a criminal offence. A lot of work is done by our online referrals bureau, who will identify where, for example, an image or a series of images has gone viral in a particular area, and they can potentially tie this down to, say, for example, school groups. And this is where conversations can be had with teachers and educational partners to identify, first of all, that a set of images is being shared by a group of children at school, and the mechanisms they can put in place to prevent this happening and to stop it happening at that source, and how this might have an impact on the children themselves, which is where I'll bring it in, Samantha, because I'm sure your team has done that on many occasions.
Yes, and I think the education element is really important, not just for children and young people, but obviously we work with both professionals and law enforcement. So we do a lot of work with our National Police Chiefs Council around the messages they give and how they talk about what children share. And I guess there is that balance between when it becomes what we would say aggravated. So we do talk in education around, for some children and young people, sharing pictures will be part of their normal development, and it's really important for us to really try and identify through educating and thinking about the scenarios. Actually, this is, if you want, experimental. It's part of, sometimes we found with our research, sometimes children share pictures for fun. They just think this is a really body positive thing to do among their friends. So it's really important to understand the context. And I think for us, education focuses on those things I talked about before, about when it becomes no longer something that a child has consented to, when actually those pictures are shared elsewhere. And I guess picking up also on the point around how do we work with social media platforms, we have alongside the education team, we have a partnership team who does work with social media platforms, again, thinking about actually how we can educate them, how they can create maybe more technological solutions. So for example, recently Apple released something through parents where if they download the app, then it will identify if pictures are being shared and kind of stop them and ask questions. So there's lots we do to try and target those behaviors from an education point of view.
If I can just add a quick point from what Samantha said, because we actually found something very similar in the Thailand report. So we asked children if they engage in these potentially risky activities like sharing naked images or videos of themselves, and we found that 9% of children said that they did. And actually, it was quite interesting to see when we asked them about the motivations behind sharing that content. Most commonly, they said it was because they were having fun or because they were in love. They thought there was nothing wrong with it. So like Samantha's saying, I think it's really important to be able to kind of deal with this in a nuanced way, to understand that it's not always being done in a coercive way, but sometimes it's just part of children's development.
Dr. Sampat, would you like me to pick up the other question quickly?
Actually, now we have question from the floor from the UNICEF, Kun Kida Magiko. So please let her ask question by herself. Thank you. Welcome, Kida.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. My name is Makiko Kida. I'm a professor of UNICEF from Japan. Thank you for your meaningful event. I myself have a baby girl, so I was interested in what I needed to prevent sexual abuse. In that sense, it was very helpful for me. By the way, my question is about a program to prevent recidivism in prison for sex offenders. What kind of treatment do you take in your country to prevent the crime of sex offenders? Or what treatment do you think to need to prevent the crime?
I think we could probably run a whole session on that in itself. So in the UK, we do have several different routes for helping offenders. Both are kind of, so one of the organisations who works in this area most prolifically is the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, and they do a lot of communications and campaigns online where they use campaigns to say, if you're having these feelings, talk to us. So they have a helpline for people who may feel they have a sexual interest in children. And this is probably one of the few proactive services there are in the UK. And over the last year that they've seen a real increase in people calling them. And then I suppose then on the other end, when we talk about sex offender treatment programs, they don't tend to happen unless someone has been arrested. And, very much there's a number of different types, but mostly they focus on working with the offender in a one-to-one situation or a group situation to understand their motivations, but also to understand the context in which that is happening and help them to change that context. Ginny, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
No, I was going to make the same point about the Lucy Faithfull Foundation dealing with setting up something from a preventative point of view. I think the sort of flip side of the treatment is also the management of sexual offenders, those that are either currently in prison or those that have been released or those that have been convicted, say, for example, for possession of indecent images but haven't in fact found themselves in prison. The UK does a lot of work in terms of sexual harm prevention orders, civil orders, travel restriction orders to make sure that those offenders aren't either, say, for example, traveling to locations to abuse children, or gaining access to internet-enabled devices. So maybe not treatment specific, but a way of preventing further offending and helping, I guess, guiding offenders in their kind of day-to-day lives as to how they themselves might not find themselves in situations where they are going down a path of offending. But I think I would agree with Samantha. It's an area that probably needs a lot more work and discussion in the UK, and a lot of that is due to sort of cultural understanding of how these offences are committed in the first place, and how offenders become offenders, what their paths of escalation, which is why I sort of spoke a little bit about the partnerships with academia, because that's not something law enforcement has any real experience in, or is anything that we can manage given our very limited resources. That's a great question. Thank you very much, Makiko.
Okay, so thank you very much, Ms. Kida and Virginia. So due to the time limitation, I would allow this as the last question. The question from the chat box: as the restoring harm report found that children tend not to use official channel to report, how the CEOP reporting system differs from any official channel. So please.
I think this is really important. So actually our reporting system has been set up almost so it looks different. So it's very much aimed at children and young people. It sits on a separate website, but also the people responding to reports are child protection advisors. They're not police officers as we would know them. So the response that children get when they report in is very different. They are talking to someone who understands how to respond to a child in a way which is going to be supportive. And I think also the other benefit we have for our reporting system is it sits alongside our education program. So we talk about CEOP reporting as part of education rather than, you know, police going in and talking about report to the police. We see it. So the way we communicate that reporting system, although we make it really clear they are reporting this to the police, the way we do it and talk about it is much more child friendly. And so both that initial view, but also the response they get is very different probably than if they walked into a police station and talked to a police officer.
All right, so thank you so much. Thank you for every question, and thank you, our speaker. Finally, and most importantly, I would like to express our sincere thanks to all participants, executives, academics, and all stakeholders for participating in this seminar. Also, I wish to express my appreciation to the National Crime Agency and British Embassy, which have co-organized this event with us. Thank you so much once again.